So this is part of our continuing series of episodes on what we're calling mapping Gnosticism, where we're trying not to just talk about, say, like a specific detail or a specific book in Gnosticism, but more like trying to chart the territory, as it were. And in this case, one of the things that we thought would be an interesting thing to do would be to get a sense of where Gnosticism is now, particularly among those that either call themselves Gnostic or find themselves interested in Gnosticism. And so in that spirit, we built a form. We put it up on our website and pushed it out to people on this show. I mentioned it here. We also put it on Reddit, on the R Gnostic subreddit, as well as on there's a Gnostic Discord that we put it on as well, and promoted that a few times. And yeah, we it's been a sticky comment on the subreddit, which is nice because I think we've been getting 1 or 2 submissions a day for the last month or so that it's been up, which is great. This is often a lot of work. Our work isn't time sensitive, but maybe just as a note, we're doing this episode on June 13th, which is maybe notable, if only because then if you're listening to this after June 13th, obviously, and you've submitted, it's not in this form, but maybe we'll get to it in another episode. And yeah, so maybe as a couple of things to just discuss so that you know what we're going to be talking about. I'm going to list the questions that we asked, and then John and I are going to go over some of the things that we thought were interesting about the percentages, like how much a certain element is present in the way people are coming into Gnosticism, or how people are currently engaging with it. So we're just going to discuss those. We're going to maybe note some interesting results that came out of the thing, and then we're also just going to get into some of the submissions, some interesting maybe like outliers or interesting comments that I thought would be interesting to pull out. Yeah, and anything, John, that you want to mention about this? Like, I know you just saw a lot of this data for the first time, maybe last night. Before I dive into those questions and details, is there anything you kind of want to mention about like the value of the survey or anything you noted?
I think it'll, for my part, will more come up as we discuss it. But just to reiterate that we're not going to close the survey. Anybody watching, listening, please fill it out. It'll be very helpful for us and for everybody who is watching and listening. So real fascinating stuff. And Jason, thanks so much for setting that up and getting it out there. But I'm excited to dive into it with you.
Oh, great. Yeah. Oh, and something else that's also interesting to note, and we'll get into this again. I'll probably be repeating this a lot in this episode, but there's a few people who submitted to this who actually made the point of saying that they didn't consider themselves Gnostic, but they are interested in Gnosticism. So I think that's it didn't occur to me to put on the form, do you consider yourself a Gnostic? We could maybe discuss why I didn't put that on the form along the way here as well, but yeah, just as a note, as you're listening to a lot of this, not everything that you're going to hear from the community is coming from somebody who specifically says, I am a Gnostic, I believe in X. Yeah, okay, so to kind of dive into it, I'll go over the questions and then we'll get into those percentages. This is kind of what spurred on the survey was I wanted to know, how did you first encounter Gnosticism? I think your first encounter with something often can really frame how you approach it as you continue. And so I think that was something that I was really interested to know. What's that first blush? What's that first encounter like for a lot of people, and where does it come from? Then we asked people what the name was, or any detail of that first source that they found. We asked how many years they'd been involved in Gnosticism. We asked what their current sources of Gnosticism are. So how did you first encounter it? How are you engaging with it now? With that one, we made a multiple choice. We didn't just leave it as one. Then we said, what are the names of your current Gnostic sources? So what's the thing you're currently listening to, the thing you're currently paying attention to? And then what is a Gnostic resource you wish you had? Which again, I think is interesting. This was all kind of spurred by the fact that, especially on the R Gnostic subreddit, there are a lot of questions that come up. What's the Gnostic interpretation of this? What do Gnostics think about this? That kind of thing. And it really struck me that unlike a lot of other spiritual traditions, Gnosticism doesn't have one single text that it can say this is the one single either truth or at least foundation for which we then search for truth. So I thought this was maybe an interesting question to ask to kind of get a sense of what people wish they had. So I thought that would be kind of an interesting way to go. Yeah. Anything, John, you want to kind of touch on there before I dive in?
I think just circling back to an earlier point, which I don't think derails where we're at, which is when you said that some of the responses people said, well, I'm not a Gnostic. And I think that's great. I think that's definitely stuff that we want to have in the survey, what we want to hear from people, because obviously Jason and I think that there is value in Gnosticism and Gnostic ideas for anybody's spiritual, religious, or philosophical or creative lives, right? And it's very hard to be a modern Gnostic. It's also, as we've talked about, a term that is very difficult to describe. So it doesn't matter if you're an atheist, an agnostic, an artist, a Christian, a Buddhist, a Hindu. If you're here and you're interested in these ideas, they stimulate you in some way, then this is what this show is for and what I feel Gnosticism is for, right? So I just wanted to stress that. And if you're filling out the survey, give us that information as well, because I think that there is a lot that this tradition can offer just about anybody, regardless of where they're at. Just to get that out there. But let's dive in, Jason.
Great. Yeah. Okay. Well, so the what I put in here for the how did you first encounter Gnosticism, I listed, I tried to basically cover what I felt were like the dominant modes that I could imagine, just based on my own understanding, what I've heard from other people, and then but also leave some breadth for things I couldn't imagine. So I listed blogs, books, and books is a pretty broad term, but like, an academic book or the Gnostic Bible or something like that, a group or a church community of some kind, podcasts, YouTube as a general like information resource that people are using these days, pop culture. So that could be movies, games, books, like a fiction books, that kind of thing, comics, anything like that. And then the much ambiguous umbrella of something else. So those were the topics that I put in there. And so this is based on about, I think, 86 submissions, I think, that we got as of this episode. And I'll note that this is not a scholarly study. Obviously 84 results or 86 results is not, we haven't, polled every Gnostic, if that makes sense. There's lots of people who either didn't fill out the survey or would have put in a lot of other information. But among those who did answer, this is what came up. And I think a few things that I think are interesting here is that the highest represented categories are books at the highest, 31%. YouTube is pretty high at 20% or almost 21%. And something else is pretty high at 27.9%. So I think that really strikes me as interesting. I'm a little sad because I know we're on YouTube here as well, but I consider Talk Gnosis kind of a podcast. That's how I consume it. So I'm a little sad that podcasts are only 4.6%. But be that as it may.
Well, really, we're a YouTube show. The original founder of the network, the podcast wasn't introduced until a couple of years ago because he was scared that it would cannibalize YouTube because he wanted to focus on YouTube because, as we can see from the data, that is a major source. And honestly, the podcast has cannibalized the YouTube numbers, right? So, we've lost a couple thousand people on every YouTube hit and it goes over to the podcast. But I'm fine with that because we're not trying to be YouTube stars. So that's said, we do want to stand out and for people to find us there. So, Jason, it is unfortunately nowhere in the data that I see the words "talk gnosis," but that's all right. And I would be interested to know more about something else. So, the thing with books and podcasts and some of the other things that we are seeing high, I would be interested in getting more granular. Maybe people can get back to us because for people discovering Gnosticism through us, right? Or through other YouTube shows or books. There is an obvious thing there where if you don't know what Gnosticism is, you're going to be less likely to jump into media that is specifically about Gnosticism, right? Yeah, that's why I'm curious about YouTube, such a broad category. If people are finding us finding us, if people are finding Gnosticism, it's probably not through specifically Gnostic themed media on YouTube, right? It's probably stuff that has to do with religion, the occult, culture, and history that has a show on Gnostic thought or Gnosticism, right? Probably similar thing with books. We did see for book names, people did specifically shout out stuff like the Gnostic Gospels and such. So I guess maybe that is contra everything I just said. I guess it also makes sense that people will find out about Gnosticism from specifically Gnostic media because they already have a pre-existing interest in religion and culture, right? So they pick up the book, they read the back of it, or they've, vaguely heard about this thing somewhere before, and this book looks very interesting. I think something else, something we've talked a lot about the show, but, where else are you going to find it? We live in a society that's getting more and more secular. We have a less interest in the arts and philosophy and the academic study of religion within our academies. Pop culture, right, is definitely makes sense. That is where a lot of people are going to discover Gnosticism, because as we said on the show a few times now, we won't go through the whole origin stories, that pop culture was something that helped introduce us to Gnosticism. And there's been the rise of poptimism, right? Which at first I think was a good thing, but has quickly become a very bad thing, which is sort of taking seriously pop culture. Getting rid of that divide between high culture and pop culture, because there always was sort of a classist looking down your nose aspect to the things that people actually enjoy. And now we swung way too far to the other end, where what before was considered, higher end, upper, deeper art, literature, movies, whatever, are now viewed as snobby, elite, even some political messaging around, some of the canon stuff about it being for, the white straight males. There's truth about that with the canon, absolutely, right? When you look at quote unquote the canon, but I wouldn't say, shrink the canon, let's expand the canon, right? Let's put in some more diverse voices there. So I think this taking over of all culture by pop culture has been a bad thing. This is going somewhere, Jason. But the point is that because it's become much more than even over, or much more than it was even within the last few decades, because it has taken over so much. It is our dominant form of cultural consumption, and one of the dominant forms that people are connecting to each other, and in some ways even discovering the world, right? People consume so much now that it makes sense that this is where they would discover Gnosticism. I was happy to see you were probably as well. I'm not much of a gamer. My wife says she'll divorce me if I start gaming. I would like to game more. Love is better. But I did see a couple of video games on there. I thought that was neat. Star Wars was on there. Something else that's super cool that's similar to your origin story with Dungeons and Dragons is sometimes it's just like a reference or a word, and it's stuck out in people's minds. Right. I think for the Star Wars one, it was a planet named Gnostis something. And the person's like, oh, that word's familiar. I want to know what that means. And they Google it. Right. I'm assuming that's what the origin for that was.
Let me just get it, because I'm just looking at it right now. It's a planet called Gnosis, which is where a bunch of clones are being made. And I think that's the planet. Anyway, I'm a bit of a Star Wars nerd, but I can get fuzzy on the details. But yeah, and then they literally Googled the Gnosis suffix and then discovered Gnosticism that way. So yeah, that's a really interesting thing. And actually, and I'm sorry to kind of jump in on you here, but I think what's interesting about that is that listing is under the something else percentage, although arguably I would call that a pop culture choice. But for that person, I think it's interesting that they're not associating their interest in Gnosticism of whatever amount they have connected to Star Wars. They're connecting it to the experience they had Googling the term, which I think maybe is an interesting, there's like, if you want to get a little bit woo, there's this feeling of like, perhaps, like Gnosis is that thing that you discover in unexpected corners, if that makes sense. And you might not always associate the corner that you first found it in with the thing that you're now interested in, but you're still like, I think Eric Davis said of Philip K. Dick, or maybe Philip K. Dick said this, that like something about Gnosis emerging from the trash stratum, which is this thing of like, yeah, like it's showing up for in the unlooked places, And actually, just to kind of touch in, like, I know we were both saying there, like, what's that something else? It's pretty highly represented here. I'm just going to do a quick overview. There, Wikipedia shows up a couple times. People just saying that they were thinking a lot about religion and then discovered it. ChatGPT makes an appearance. I don't love that personally, but hey, that's how somebody found it. French Rosicrucian booklets. I think that's fascinating to me.
Yep.
Encounters with their holy guardian angel, and then research led them to Gnostic texts. Friends, Current 93, the neo-folk movement, which I would again put with friend, or even the other option I put in there of group or church. 5 grams and Silent Darkness. That's an outlier there, but I think that's, like, hey, that's whatever brought you in. So yeah, I think there's something valuable about the fact that a significant percentage of people didn't feel like it was easy to define the one way they came in.
Yeah, Jason, it's fun. A few people did mention they discovered Gnosticism through direct encounters with the divine. So that's definitely one way to do it. And at least one person said, it might have been the person chatting to ChatGPT, is they just described some of their own spiritual insights and where their thought was at. And the computer told them, oh, the religion for you is Gnosticism. You're describing Gnosticism. And I think that has a resonance with people. A lot of times when you do discover it, it feels familiar. It feels like home. It's ideas you've already been thinking about or pondering. And for all of its reputation as being highly philosophical, complicated, hard to understand, all the scholarship, Gnosticism at the end of the day is the annoying kid at the back of the class of Sunday school, right? Who keeps raising their hand, being like, well, why, if you didn't want them to eat that fruit, why do you put the tree there? As well as some of those deeper, more profound speculations on life, the universe, and everything. So I always find that's very interesting. There is something already there that is singing to people. So when they just encounter part of an idea, a reference, one part of the Gnostic mythos, they're activated and want to dig in more because it reminds them of something that is already within. So I find that very, very interesting. And, in general, the contradiction of the time that we live in, we all have these supercomputers that give us all of human knowledge in our pockets, right? But standing out can be quite difficult. And before, Gnostic information was hard to find, right? Even in the modern era, if you walked into a bookstore or a library, you're not going to have shelves and shelves of Gnostic material. You might have a shelf, but in a library, in an academic library, but not in a bookstore. So your exposure is much more difficult. And if you did encounter a Gnostic idea, you're reading Philip K. Dick, what have you, then again, what's your next move? You go to your corner library, you look it up in the encyclopedia, you order in some books, and you wait. Maybe they're good books, maybe they're bad, maybe they're incredibly academic and not very fun to read. So now we live in, of course, the exact opposite of that, where you can get too much information about Gnosticism at the drop of the hat, including some very bad information about Gnosticism. So,
go ahead. No, finish your thought.
Yeah, so I just find it very interesting, and that it continues to be a thing that is difficult to discover and engage with. Now, with the opposite problem, too much information. Yet this contradiction that I'm always bringing up, and it could be the mental illness that I've given myself through Gnosticism. But of course, I just see it everywhere. I just find it so relevant to the history of Western thought. And when you go digging into a wide variety of art and religious thought and philosophy, you find stuff that is clearly Gnostic. So it's so important, and we were constantly swimming in it. Yet it's this thing that is still partly invisible to us. So I'm glad that people are finding it, and I'm really excited to discover exactly how they're finding it. And I kind of wish, Jason, maybe people will get back to us, or as we continue our Talking to a Gnostic mini-series that we occasionally do. which is the understanding that next step, the person finding the Star Wars planet, or someone listening to a podcast about the history of religion, and there's a little diversion into this strange heretical sect. What was it there? What was the spark? Am I making sense? Like, what was it that, instead of all the other references, this is the one that made you glom on and wanted to know more, and made you hungry or thirsty for this material?
Totally. And I think that's the what grabbed you question is huge. I definitely want to get into that. I think I want to leave some space for it, because I've got sort of bigger thoughts, and I want to stay just currently in that, like, the discussing how people first encountered it element. So I think the something else as evidence that it defies classification to a certain point, that, like, nearly a third of people discovering it are discovering it in a way that they can't easily wrap around. And I think books are interesting. I think this might be we don't need to go too deep into this, but there's often a feeling that Gnosticism is a very bookish or academic religion or spiritual tradition or what have you. And I think that is often true, if only because so much of the information, so much of the verifiable information that we have about it is academic, is academic or historical, which is good. I think that's a good thing. But it does also mean that if you're, like, I think for us, when we're trying to talk about Gnosticism, we often tend to start at books, start at texts, and, like, have you read this book? Have you read this text? And also too, it does mean that when we're talking about it, we can say, well, like, hey, you can be involved in X or Y tradition, but we're talking about these texts, these traditions, that kind of thing. I tend to blur the lines a lot, but I still always try to go, like, how does this seem like it connects to the history and the text that we know? But I want to come back to the YouTube thing. So now I think part of it is, like, as you mentioned, the founder of the channel had a real desire to put out YouTube content. I think then and now it's a very dominant mode for people to encounter a lot of information. It's like I think in some respects I'm too Gen X to fully understand it, but it's like, I think it's become an experience that people have as it's a matter of course. Of course you'd watch a YouTube video on the subject as much as you would read a book, because it's fairly highly represented here. And I think also to shout out to people like Esoterica, who is, I think, well represented on the survey as a place that people discovered Gnosticism through him talking about it, through Dr. Sledge, and then coming and then Googling and searching, etc. I think that's amazing. The but I don't know if people can hear that in my tone yet, is that the thing that I'm concerned about regarding YouTube is that out of all of the sources that are listed here, it's the one that is the most algorithmically controlled, and it is the one that is inside a walled garden, if that makes sense, at a certain point. And so, like, I mean, I don't know I don't know how much I can really get into it, but, like, I think so. In other episodes, we've talked about issues around like an over focus on things like the demiurge and the archons, and, like, the world is a prison and the world is a terrible place, like a sort of a focus on, like, what I'm starting to call halfway Gnosticism, where you're not really focused on Gnosis, but you're focused on all of the cosmology from Gnosticism that tells you why the world is bad. Like, to me, if that's all you're focused on, then you're not really focused on Gnosis. You've just moved the goalposts of, like, defining meaning in your life, but you're not looking for salvific knowledge. I mean, that's a broad statement, but the reason I say all of this is that answer that this sort of halfway Gnosticism can provide is a very seductive answer, and it's something that I think is particularly easy on a platform like YouTube to cater to, and that if you're a content creator on YouTube, you might now, I wouldn't say this of Dr. Sledge. In fact, it's quite the opposite. I don't think he pursues things purely based on what he thinks will do well algorithmically. But like, between there being AI generated, 3-hour videos of a robot voice and AI imagery giving you vague Gnostic esque scripture that isn't actually scripture, or even just content creators that are making content that they hope will grab your attention in a YouTube fashion, if that makes sense. This is a thing that I guess like I don't want to wag my finger and say you shouldn't be doing it, because it's whether or not I agree with it, it's happening. But I guess it's a thing that concerns me, or it's a thing that I want to keep my eye on, if that makes sense, because I think Gnosis can appear in the trash stratum, as we discovered through the something else. Like it pops up in many different places. I'm happy that something else and books are better represented than YouTube here, but that if you are listening to this and you do find that Gnosticism is that YouTube is your primary source for Gnosticism, I would really strongly encourage you to try, like, to listen to some podcasts, find some blogs, find some books, find some community, because find some places where you can encounter more Gnostic ideas that aren't focused on an algorithm making sure you see it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Just a slight asterisk to everything Jason just said. The exception to that, of course, is our 200 show back catalog. So just stay on this channel. Don't do anything that the algorithm tells you to do, and just patiently watch each video. You can slow it down to halftime and patiently watch each video.
Actually, to that point too, is that if you are if you are going to be on YouTube, remember that you are on an algorithmic platform, and know that you don't need to watch whatever is being recommended to you, that you can go to a channel, you can look at its list, you can find, you can scroll through what it's got there, you can control it. This actually reminds me of Douglas Rushkoff's book, Program or Be Programmed. And one of the main tenets of the book is he basically says, remember that all of these online spaces that we are in, someone designed, and they are not natural. They're not forces of nature. They're not zeitgeists or anything like that. And so you can take control of them. You can take control of them because people are controlling them. And just to keep that in mind.
Yeah. And I think it's something we have thoroughly discussed on the show. I'm sure we'll have opportunities to do more programming on it in the future. But Gnosticism has these themes of conspiracy, oppression, liberation, alienation. And these themes are sort of reinterpreted in the 20th century, where more emphasis is placed upon them, right? Particularly before the Nag Hammadi stuff was really floating around, and it kind of becomes combined with existentialism. And a lot of scholars, a lot of people who like Gnosticism will kind of talk about how this is, let's say, bad thing, but it doesn't allow us to really see what these texts were originally saying in their original context, right? And I don't think it's a bad thing. As I've talked about before, there's things I like about this existentialist interpretation of Gnosticism, and things that are useful, to use a Jason term, right? In this age of oppression, alienation, and conspiracy, we can see why, particularly on a platform like YouTube, where people are hitting just those themes or interpreting Gnosticism exclusively through those lenses, and only talking about those themes, or even worse, in a less valid way, reinterpreting Gnosticism into something that has nothing to do with Gnosticism, which is a conspiracy theory. We can see why this stuff would do well on YouTube. Right, because they have changed the algorithm many times, since 2020, but it's still kind of sensational, conspiratorial, schizophrenic. It does well. So I think that's something else just to add to Jason. And we don't want to sound like broken records. And at the same time, I want everybody to be a weird nerd like I am and just read about Gnosticism all the time. But I'll even put on my clergy hat here, my clergy collar, which I forgot to put on for this recording, which is just be nice and help people and occasionally pray or meditate so you feel close to the divine, right? Like, at the end of the day, please just do that. That's all you need to do. And you don't need to become an expert in obscure Gnostic sects and in each complicated Greek term, right? But if you are drawing on Gnosticism for your creative, artistic, or philosophical life, just use some good resources, and we're not giving you homework. You don't have to read a stack of books or take one of the great courses or take an online course or work it into your schedule. So I guess I'm just sort of really hitting Jason's point home, which is you don't have to become an expert. You don't have to dive into all this complicated stuff if you're still interested in this stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it is not a requirement, in my humble opinion. But just make sure that whatever sources you are drawing on are good, reliable, flexible,
Mm-hmm.
and make sense for whatever it is that you're using them for in the way that you are incorporating Gnosticism into your life, be it
Mm-hmm.
as a faith or as a hermeneutic lens or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's actually a great segue into what we the percentages that I brought out of the current sources percentages. One maybe thing that's a little interesting about this these series of percentages, just from a data perspective, is that the current sources I've made a multiple choice option, whereas the first encounter was a single choice. So what we got out of that first list was each person's, like whatever they defined their first encounter as. So that's the 86 people who submitted. The current sources I left as multiple choice. So if all 84 people said, or 86 people said books, then books would be very highly represented. And then there's also books, community of some kind, podcasts, YouTube channels, pop culture, again, something else. So very similar to the first series of questions, but the numbers are going to be a little different because people could choose multiple options. So I think that's maybe just an interesting point, and it maybe also explains the spread of it a little, the different spread of data or of percentages. So again, I'll just kind of go over some quick numbers here. Books, again, very highly represented, 32%. Community really rises up. I think it was in the first encounter, a group or community of some kind was only 3%. Now it's 22%.
Yeah, found that very interesting too.
Yeah. YouTube stays at 20, so that didn't change too much. Podcast goes up to 9%. Pop culture is at 6%, which is about the same as the 8% I was at before. Something else goes all the way down to 9%. I think that's really interesting to me. So I think just the reason I thought this was a good segue was because I think and maybe this just might be something that we didn't need a survey to tell us, but I think it's interesting, is that so people find something weird in Gnosticism, they go looking around for it, they find texts, they find books, they do find podcasts went up. So I think and Talk Gnosis is on there. I think there's 8 references to Talk Gnosis overall on the spreadsheet. So people aren't discovering Gnosticism through Talk Gnosis, but they are engaging with Gnosticism due to Talk Gnosis, hopefully, which I think is interesting. And other channels, there's a few other channels on there, but that's the community really goes up. And I think that's one thing that I think is so fascinating, and perhaps for me, an optimistic element of this is that it's not just that people are finding it as a tradition and then saying, great, this answers all of my spiritual questions, I'll just go be a Gnostic in my room. They want to talk about it. They want to ask questions about it. They want to preach about it. They want to tell people why the world is terrible, or they want to tell people this great experience that they had. I think so discourse happens a lot. I think that's really interesting to me. I don't know how much of that community is part of a faith tradition. I don't know how many of them are identifying. I know some of them are part of the AJC, which you're a deacon in. There's, but I mean, I know there's also the Reddit itself. I mean, we posted this on Reddit and Discord, so Reddit and Discord are probably high numbers here.
That's what I was thinking. It's only 80 some people, right? So 10% is almost 9 people. So there could be enough AJCers in there, but it is fascinating, and it's definitely the direction we wanted to go in. As I said, I think online community is better than nothing. I think there's a lot of dangers with it. I think it's best if online community sort of backs up a real world community, kind of the way that it does with the AJC, right? Which is quite dispersed, has small parishes all around the world, has individual members in isolated places, not close to a parish. So the net does quite a bit there. I wonder too, though, what we need more data, Jason. People will have to tell
Mhm.
us what they mean by that, because it can be book clubs, it can be faith communities. There's not very many Gnostic churches, but again, because we only have some 80 some people, right? Just a few of those going to a Gnostic church would juice the numbers, but that would be amazing. I
Mhm.
wonder if there's anybody in there too where you can take Gnosticism into whatever your religious life is, as I keep saying. So are people sort of, if you're in a very liberal denomination, like a Unitarian, right?
Mhm.
That is a
Mhm.
place where you could discuss Gnosticism, talk about it with other people, kind of bring it into that wider community. I don't know if anybody's doing that, or if they are starting book clubs, or if it is kind of primarily, I suspect, Jason, it's primarily three things, which is
Mm.
Reddit, Discord, and the AJC.
Yeah.
But I will definitely take it. So if I see that C word in there, it's great. And 22%, getting up there like that, I think is really amazing. So it really does warm my heart. I'd like to know more
Mhm.
about it, but it's definitely the way to go, people. Unless you become a formal monastic, but even, well, no, unless you become a hermit. That's the misconception about monks, nuns, and monastics, right? It's the opposite of being a loner. You spend the rest of your life in a very, 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 very close knit community. Yeah,
Mhm.
the reason why they have vows of silence, I think, is not a spiritual discipline, but so that you don't kill each other.
Mhm.
So generally in the religious life, with the exception of becoming a hermit, it pushes you towards community. So I think sometimes with the interpretations of Gnosticism as being highly individual, again, that existentialist reading of it, you sort of lose the importance of connecting to other people and the divine spark that is in other people.
Mhm.
The injunction to know thyself in Gnosticism, the other knows us better than we could ever know ourselves. So I am
Mhm.
happy to
Mhm.
see that is Gnosticism, folks. If you start taking this initial contact into community in whatever way that you can, so really happy to see that on the survey, and I hope that it just keeps growing.
Mhm. There's so this may be to kind of start to wrap this up here a bit. And something I mentioned at the beginning was that not everybody on the forum identifies as a Gnostic, and but then there's a moment you mentioned something just as you're in your own like interest as a Gnostic, that you encounter all of these concepts and things in history and in a lot of the academic work that you're involved in, and that you said it was so clearly Gnostic. And I'm going to put words in your mouth here, but I don't think you meant it was so clearly Gnostic as in it was a specifically, intentionally, esoterically coded statement by someone for a
Yes.
specific text. It was an emergent quality that is parallel to or analogous to a Gnostic mode of thought or approach.
Yeah, well, actually, I would say both, which is exactly what you just said, right? Basically, people reach to the same conclusions,
Mhm.
but I think as well we actually do have a lineage of ideas that goes back to the ancient Gnostics that has sort of seeped into other knowledge systems. Right.
Mhm.
And they originally come from the Gnostics, or they were so highlighted by the Gnostics, they become important. And that's
Mhm.
just something that is kind of completely missed, right?
Mhm.
That just
Mhm.
kind of goes over our heads because Gnosticism is not prevalent. And again, it's just, a separated idea that has become detached and sort of sunk into the unconscious of the West. So yeah,
Yeah.
both of those, I would say, Jason. And a lot of the time it is, Gnosticism is just constantly being recreated, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So people are coming to the same conclusions. But I think it is out there in a very direct sub rosa way, or at least aspects of it. It just was so influential, and then the later Gnostic movements that do come up in a combination of spontaneity and inspired by a handful of ideas that are still floating around, right? And that sort of
Mhm.
reinforces that, right? When new Gnostic groups come up, inspire artists and thinkers and philosophers, even if it's downstream or secondhand or third hand, and kind of reinforces that original stream, pours into that original stream coming from the second century. So
Mhm.
it is, that stream is constantly being watered. And again, I just think it's almost pernicious that people don't know more about Gnosticism and Gnosis and how these ideas connect when they are floating around so much.
Well, and I think there's maybe two, like my sense would be is that it's that, like, I think that sub rosa was an interesting way to put it, because I think there's also a sense in which there's a lineage of ideas but that not even everybody in that lineage knows their full lineage, if that makes sense. That there are people who are, in the like 18th century or the 15th century or what have you, who are only really looking back at the text that inspired them or the idea that inspired them. And we can do the chain of association and make some level of claim that there's a tradition there. But that I think, like, at least as far as I know, that there isn't necessarily like someone whispering in one person's ear all the way down saying Valentinius said this kind of thing. Yep. You know what I mean? Like there's no copyright claim that can go the whole way across.
This direct lineage, no, or a single organization that like the Catholic Church, which is not only a lineage, but can claim to go all the way back to 2,000 years, right? You don't have anything like that, like Gnosticism. You don't have anything like that secretly in Gnosticism. Mm-hmm. These lineages of ideas are just that, right? Ideas have become detached and sort of float around. Or, a good example might even be something like the Gospel of John, which is probably originally a Gnostic text, right? And it gets into the Bible, it stays in the Bible, and John's not read, interpreted, or understood as a Gnostic text, but the Gnostic ideas are still there, right? So they periodically come out as people and inspire people when they're engaging with that text, and probably engaging with that text and engaging with other things too, like contemplations on life, their own spiritual experiences. They're reading Plato, they're reading Genesis. You put it into a soup and Gnosticism is recreated, but you do have a bit of a spark to the fire, right, by having this text, even if it's not being properly understood or interpreted. So yeah, I think those things happen.
And the other thing that so like you also used you said like to give it a Jason Memelism there to say about to call something useful. I think that was something that's interesting to me in terms of this, and the fact that somebody had to highlight. I saw it on Reddit this morning. I filled out the survey, but I don't consider myself a Gnostic. I think, that was really interesting to hear and to be reminded of. And again, to like, as something that we've been saying here. So yes, there's a chain of ideas, but I think there's also the genre, as you've talked about it before, of Gnosticism as a genre of spiritual traditions that you can make a claim that various texts are Gnostic. Like if we were to say, like, there's like Marxist theory and feminist theory, we could say there's a Gnostic theory. Does the text have an oppressive sense, etc.? Like we could go down a whole rabbit hole here, and we should have Nick Lichetti on here because I think he's working on a project exactly like this. But that also, if you start to think of Gnosticism as an approach and not a faith, a specific faith, I think it becomes more useful. Because again, like there's always questions on the subreddit of like, what do Gnostics believe about X? What do Gnostics believe about Y? How do Gnostics deal with X and Y? And the default response is generally either that there's no single answer, but here's some ideas, or somebody going, I believe this, and this is exactly what you should do. And both of those exist next to each other, which is just, I think, so like it's a wonderful way to point out that there is no one answer. There is no single response. And I think that, again, this whole survey really highlights that there's no, if there was a dominant Gnostic tradition, quote unquote, then probably we would have seen one of those percentages be like at like 60%. You know what I mean? But that's not true. Like there's no way in which Gnosticism is a monolithic entity and a monolithic tradition or even an approach, other than to say, be critical, critical of the text that you examine, of the traditions you join, that kind of thing. And but also like look for wisdom, look for the spark, try to identify that spark. That's what seems to kind of also emerge from the results, because we boiled things down to percentages here, but there are so many interesting little cul-de-sacs and ideas and like things I never heard of or things I barely remembered of ways that people are engaging with or encountering Gnosticism, and it's only ever going to get wider. So make sure you keep your eye as wide as possible, and your ear as open as possible to listening to the variety of ideas, and not say, oh, this isn't Gnostic because it didn't come from this text, or because it didn't because it doesn't align with how I feel Gnosticism should work, but rather, why am I reacting that way? Where are they coming from? I often rail against the sort of default easy, I think it's easy, world-hating Gnosticism that says everything's a prison and we just need to escape. But I should also remember, even my own reaction here is worth noting, because that's clearly answering a need for somebody. So there's no one true Gnosticism, including my version of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Jason, even the world hating and want to get out, there's also what you mean by terms and different levels of interpretation as well. Mm-hmm. So I too have a reaction to that, but of course at the same time I believe it in a way when I put a particular interpretation on it, right? Because there is this aspect to being that is contradictory, beautiful, wonderful, awful, suffering. The world can be a very oppressive place. But maybe the getting out is not literally getting out, right? It's not leaving my body and going somewhere that's better, right? Which is what most people mean by that. Maybe the getting out is the discovery of the divine spark here in the prison with us, right? And that liberates us. But I hear what you're saying, and I think Gnosticism, more than just about any other faith, has the potential to, or has a call to, extreme humility in our ontological understandings, right? Extreme humility. It's always calling for that. So I think it's a good reminder for you and I and everybody who loves this stuff, that I think this is a central aspect to the faith, which is, take a breath, take a step back and leave your sureties at the door. Yeah, and so same here. There is some interpretations of Gnosticism that get my backup, and I have to realize that is my own shit, right? That's something for me to deal with. It doesn't have to do with the other person, unless they're doing some sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory or just saying that it's space aliens, or I have some exceptions to that, Jason, shape-shifting reptiles and what have you. But besides that, definitely. So I think we should wrap up. I want to thank everybody for filling this out, and we are going to keep it up, Jason. So we'll probably do a follow-up to the show. So everybody, please fill that out. I'm sure we will even expand it in the future, and it's going to be helpful for us, for you, for everybody. So thank you so much, and help us keep doing the show by going to patreon.com/Gnostic or paypal.me/Gnostic.
Exactly. And maybe one more a cliffhanger then maybe is that I think the question that I didn't ask on this survey, and maybe I should create another survey or another way to collect this as well. So stay tuned for more information about that. But I think the question of what grabbed you about Gnosticism, what keeps you in Gnosticism, that's the thing that I think I didn't ask, that might actually be one of the core it's a core question that is missing, because I think that's again something that's not necessarily the same for everybody. I did a talk for the AJC Conclave a while ago called or vaguely around the idea of who else is in the room, which I'm kind of getting at what are the other assumptions that that you are making about your faith tradition or someone else's faith tradition that only you can see, or that someone else is worried is in the room that they can't see and then they need to figure out. And I think the what grabbed you is a good way to find out that who else is in the room, or what other baggage are you bringing into Gnosticism? I shouldn't say baggage in a pejorative sense, but what is the thing? Yeah. What's the spark for you? And everybody's spark is valid. It just is not mutually exclusive. Like your spark doesn't mean someone else's spark is wrong,
Yeah. No, I think we'd find some pretty fascinating answers. So, and I think the variety might surprise us more than we know right now. But yes.
I hate to do this, but say so in the comments. Yeah. That's the typical, tell me what you thought in the comments. That's a way to create engagement. But I actually sincerely mean it. We're going to try to create some sort of survey way to collect this in a better way. But in the meantime, if you're listening to this or watching this on the YouTube comments, please feel free to add your response as to what grabs you about Gnosticism. And we'll try to do a future show on it.
Fantastic. Okay, Jason. Till then.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.